maybe some of you will remember or have had this experience where you've been in a relationship with someone, fairly new maybe, and you come to that momentous occasion of having to meet their parents. I remember that. Felt very nervous having to do that. But sometimes when you meet the parents of someone, things begin to make sense. Like you think, that's where he gets that turn of phrase from, or that's why she does that or thinks that. Meeting someone's parents is a really good way of getting some insight into who they really are. And it was suggested to me quite helpfully, I think, by someone once, that this can be a good way to view the New Testament and the Old Testament. Okay, you can know the New Testament, you can love the New Testament, but you can never really understand it unless you meet its parents, the Old Testament. And I think this is true of prayer, because in the New Testament there's a lot of teaching about prayer, a lot of things said about prayer. But in the Old Testament, we get an incredibly rich example of what prayer looks like. And the Psalms were Jesus' prayer book. The teaching about prayer in the New Testament has to be taken in context of the examples of all the prayers we have in the Old Testament. And it's a rich tapestry of prayer that we get in the Old Testament. We get the Psalms, obviously, but we get people praying in all kinds of situations. We get prayers of praise and celebration, prayers of intercession, people praying during struggles, people asking God for things, all kinds of prayers. And today, we read about Hezekiah and one of his prayers. Now, Hezekiah is the king of Judah during a very difficult time. After Solomon was king, one of the kings of Israel, the kingdom split into two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the northern kingdom of Israel has just been wiped out by the Assyrians, the Assyrian army. And the Assyrians are on the doorstep of Judah, the southern kingdom. And Hezekiah is the king of the southern kingdom. And we read about Hezekiah, he's not having a good time of it. Not only is this going on, he is sick. And he is so sick, he's dying, essentially. And we hear that Isaiah, the prophet, comes to him and says, get your things in order, you're finished, you're done. This is it for you. Now, Hezekiah is a good king. He's not a perfect king. But by the standards of the Old Testament, he's a good king, because in the Old Testament, kings tend to be judged not by their political achievements or their military victories, but they are judged by whether or not they are faithful to God. And Hezekiah is one of the kings in the Old Testament who has been faithful on the whole, who takes God seriously. And we see this in Hezekiah's life. This is not the only prayer of Hezekiah we get. Just previously, we hear about Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, who has, as I said, he's conquered the northern kingdom. He's now on the doorstep of the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And he sends Hezekiah the king a letter. And the letter says, you can't win this fight. You think your God will save you. Well, everyone thought that. And look what's happened. We've wiped out everyone who stood against us. Your God won't save you. And Hezekiah, we read in just the chapter before, when he receives this letter, he doesn't sort of summon his advisors and say, what are we going to do? He doesn't call a war council. We read, he goes into the temple and he spreads out this letter in the temple, and he basically says to God, God, have you read this letter? What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? You have Hezekiah, the king of Judah, the sort of most powerful man in the nation. And when he hits trouble, his response is to basically go to God and say kind of like, Dad, the big kids are bullying me. That's what he does. That's how he prays. And there's an almost childlike quality to the way Hezekiah prays and the way he approaches God. And what we've read today is his response to the news he gets. He is sick, he's ill, he's dying. And Isaiah the prophet comes and says, you're going to die. Get your things in order. And his response is to turn and face the wall. That's maybe an unusual response. Why does he do that? I mean, there are lots of different reasons why we might think he does that. But I think it's because this is his natural response to difficult situations, to his struggles, to bad times, is he wants to go, like before when he received a letter, he wants to go to the temple, he wants to be with God, he wants to lay it out before God. And here he receives more bad news, and his instinct is to do the same thing, to go immediately to God. But he can't go to the temple because he's dying. He's sick. He's ill. You can imagine him sort of stretched out on a couch or his bed, maybe in his chambers or in a throne room or somewhere. And there's advisors with him and Isaiah there and people around him, but he wants to be alone. And the best he can do is to just turn himself, maybe roll over on his bed, whatever it is, to face the wall, to shut out everyone around him and just be him and God. Once again, the King of Judah reverts to the type of a child. And then he prays. And what does he pray? How would you pray, having received particularly bad news like this? You might pray, God, heal me. You might pray, God, have mercy on me. You might pray, God, help me to face my end with dignity and poise or anything like that. But this is not how Hezekiah prays. He essentially comes to God and says, God, this isn't fair. I don't deserve to be treated like this. He turns his face to the wall and prays, God, I don't deserve this. I have been faithful. Have you forgotten how I've served you? How I've desired you? You're not treating me right. You ever feel like that? Have you ever felt like that? Moments in your life where you feel like, God, you're not treating me fairly. God, you're not behaving how I think you should behave. God, I don't deserve this. Have you ever felt like that? I'm sure many of you, maybe all of us, have at times felt like that. And the question is, what do you do with that? Does that become prayer for you? Or do you just sort of bury that? This is not a worthy feeling. Maybe you've been conditioned or thought that you don't come to God with that. You don't come to God's presence and complain. You don't come to God and whine. You don't come to God and tell him he's not treating you fairly. That's not how you speak to God. That's not how you address God. What do you expect God to do? He won't listen to prayer like that. He won't respond to prayer like that. He should send you on your way with a clip round the ear for behaving like that. Maybe that's part of you thinks that, feels that, thinks this is not how I should pray. This is not what prayer is. This is why I think the Old Testament is quite beautiful on the subject of prayer. It's not just Jesus and Paul who teach us what prayer looks like. We learn, as they did, from the prayers of Abraham, Moses, Hezekiah, and others too. Because in the Old Testament, we have a lot of examples of how people pray when they are completely broken. And I can tell you this, brokenness is very good for your prayer life. To be honest, if we learn how to pray just from, say, church or public expressions of prayer or visible expressions of prayer, we can pick up some bad habits. We can think that prayer, a proper prayer, has to be tidy, has to be formal, has to have a clear beginning, a clear end, has to be polite, has to be unemotional, somewhat rehearsed, maybe a little unnatural. Those are the type of lessons we can learn sometimes from looking at public prayer. Ruth went to a church once when she was a student, and she was in a study group in the church, and they were they were praying or talking about prayer, and one of the people she was in this group with said to her, I think they may have sort of questioned the way she prayed or something like that. They said, you have to pray to the Father. If you don't pray to the Father, you have to pray to the Father. Ruth said, does that mean if I pray to Jesus, my prayers won't be heard? And this person said, yes. You have to pray to the Father. That's how you pray. Despite the fact I can think of at least 2 examples in the New Testament of prayers being addressed to Jesus. But this was kind of what she was told in this church. You have to pray to the Father or your prayers won't be heard. Now, this is what we do to ourselves. This is what we do to prayer. Prayer is this magnificent, wonderful, mysterious thing. You never quite know how it's going to turn out. You never quite know what God's going to do. And our response is often to take it, and what do? We try and figure it out. We put it under the microscope. We say, how does it work? How can I make sure my prayers are heard? How can I get God to do what I want him to do? What words do I need to use? You have to pray to the Father or your prayers won't be heard. Well, we're told if we pray in Jesus' name, Jesus will do what we ask. So that's what I'll say. I'll pray in Jesus' name. Maybe, God will be impressed by my humility if everything I ask for, I add, Lord, if it's your will at the end of it. We try and figure out what makes prayer work. What words we can use to make our prayers acceptable to God, as though prayer is a matter of finding the right words, the right time of day, the right posture. And I think when we pray, we're primarily concerned with words, the words we use. But the words, the posture, all these things are just tools that we have been given. Tools that we have been given to bring God something more than words, to bring him our hearts. That's what prayer is. It's a matter of bringing to God our hearts, because it is the heart that God looks at always. It is the heart that God is searching. And if our prayers, our words, do not reflect our heart, we have to ask, am I praying? Or am I just playing some kind of game with God? Paul reminds us in Romans 8, he says, you know what, you don't even need words to pray. Sometimes we don't have the words. He says, and the Spirit intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express. I think the words we use in prayer are often more for our benefit than for God's. Because if we read the passage today, it turns out that God can read your tears. It turns out that God hears what you're asking for, even if you don't actually ask for anything. When you pray, God is listening to your heart. Sometimes words just get in the way. Sometimes I feel like all I'm bringing to God is kind of like the wreckage of my life. It's all I have to give to him today. And prayer, I feel, is sometimes me sitting in that rubble, sorting through it, trying to find something useful to bring to God. Something presentable, something logical, something coherent, and sometimes there isn't anything. You've just got that rubble, that wreckage. Not knowing what I should say, what I should do, what I should think, not even knowing what I should ask for when I come to God. And it's a comfort to me, it should be a comfort to any of us, that this is actually prayer. This is prayer. And not just this is prayer that God hears. This is prayer that God makes sense of. And this is not just prayer that God hears and makes sense of, but this is prayer that God responds to. Hezekiah just comes to God and says, God, this is not right. I've been faithful. Why are you doing this to me? And he cries. And Isaiah is not even out of the building before God says to him, you've got to go back. You've got to go back. Tell Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer and I have seen your tears. It's a blessing, it's a comfort. At least it should be, to have a God who accepts our tears as prayer. A God who, when we bring him nothing but a pile of nonsense and rubbish, reaches into that and pulls out a nugget of gold and says, this is what you're really after. This is what you really want. And this is what I'm going to do. You've searched me, Lord, says David, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise, you see my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, Lord. How can you not love such a God? How can you not want to come to a God like that in your struggles? A God who knows what you are saying when you don't know what you are saying. A God who knows what you need when you don't know what you need. Now, this is not the only way to pray in difficult times, in challenging times. This is not the only response that gets God's attention. We see that later as we go through these prayers that we're looking at in this series. But this is a way to pray when you are struggling. And it is a way that God does not despise. To come to him in tears and just to say, God, what are you doing? That is a prayer that God accepts. We mustn't fall into the trap of thinking, right, so this is the right way to pray then. This is the way to get my prayers heard and answered. This is the prayers that work. I've been praying wrong. I need to pray more like Hezekiah. Maybe I can squeeze out a few tears to show God that I'm really serious. That's not how it works. That's precisely what I'm saying. Sometimes we approach prayer as though something magical is happening. It's a magic spell or something. If we find the right combination of words, we find the right posture, we'll get what we want. We'll get what we're asking for. But there is no secret. There is no magic way of prayer, because prayer is not a way of manipulating God. It is a way of being with God. The point is, when you turn to face the wall, when you close yourself off from the world, when it's just you and God, I don't know if there's a right way to pray and a wrong way to pray. I'm not sure there is. The point is that God, in that moment, is reading your heart. That's what he's reading. And that is more important than the words that you use. When we pray to God in our need, you can just bring him your heart, whatever is on it. You can bring him the honesty of feeling hard done by, feeling unloved, feeling that he has not done the right thing by you. You can bring that to him and trust him to sort through that, to sort through the mess and find and hear the real prayer, what you're really asking for. Trust him to know what it is you're asking for, what it is you really need, even if you yourself don't know, don't understand, don't have a clue. Trust him to hear the unspoken prayer that maybe you don't even know that you're praying. But I think, like Hezekiah, if there's one thing we can see, that to pray like this, you need to be willing to lay your soul bare before God. You can't hold anything back. You must turn yourself to the wall, like Hezekiah. You find that private place, as much privacy as you can find, and you let God see you as you really are. That's prayer. Trusting that he'll be able to make some sense of that. He'll be able to make sense of the picture. He can bring order out of the chaos. That's what he does. It's what he's done since the very beginning. and have the courage, I suppose, to shed that dignity and majesty of your position and come to him saying, God, Father, what's going on here? What are you doing?